I'm Darren from Newrad Solutions. Today's project, we're modernizing a 1969 Mustang with a 347 sporting a Phytech EFI system to a Dakota Digital RTX gauge cluster with optional GPS. I'm going to show you how easy it is to wire and install the new gauge system using the Digital Easy Harness kit along with our optional tack wiring kit. Since the car was not factory equipped with the tachometer, we will need to supply a wire. Digital Easy Harness kit makes wiring easy and you won't have to trace a single wire color. Just follow the wiring table, making for an easy DIY project. Although we are showing a Dakota Digital install, the Digital Easy Harness kit does work with other gauge kits such as Holley Pro Dash, Autometer Invasion, and of course many others. The installation kit, you'll simply snap the connector onto the OEM dash connector, route the wires to the control box and plug them in. It really is that simple. The kit provides everything you need to wire the gauge cluster. Using the Dakota Digital gauges, our owner is able to eliminate the A-pillar gauges and adds a proper tachometer and accurate 5-volt gauges. Dakota Digital RTX series features period correct styling, Bluetooth connectivity, and many lighting and optional gauge connectivity items. To make it clear when ordering, the kit covered in this video can be used on all 69 to 73 Mustangs. However, if you have a 1971 to 1973 Mustang with a factory tachometer, you'll want to be sure to order our Ford 12-pin kit. The steps are identical for all these years, but the clusters are different for 71 to 73. Now, the steps in this video are being done in a specific order to be the most efficient after doing many of these installs. All of the accessories mentioned in this video are available on the Newrad Solutions website. Now let's begin. First, remove the negative battery terminal. With the car on a lifter jack stands, remove the speedometer cable from the transmission. Doing this provides slack in the cable, making it easier to pull out the gauge cluster. Remove the speedometer gear from the old cable, put it on the supplied sender, and install back into the transmission. In our case, we are using the Dakota Digital's optional GPS, so we will leave the supplied sender in the transmission, but without hooking up the supplied cable. If you're not using GPS, you will use the supplied cable, run it inside the vehicle to your RTX control box, and follow the quick start guide on the color-coded control box. To remove the car console, you will work your way across the dash, starting with the screws on both A-pillars, along the dash, along the top of the dash, and then remove the entire upper dash pad, lifting it out and exposing the OEM gauge cluster. You will remove the upper console from the vehicle. Remove the screws retaining the OEM gauge cluster. Next, disconnect the gauge connector and speedometer cable from the rear of the OEM gauge cluster. At this point, you can remove the speedometer cable completely from the car. There may be some clips or maybe even zip ties holding it in from the bottom, so you want to remove those. Remove the screws holding the OEM gauges to the bezel. You will not reuse the OEM lenses. Factory screws, you'll now attach the Dakota Digital Dash to the OEM bezel. As stated previously, you will not use the factory lenses, but you will reuse the rubber bushings. Plug in the supplied connector cables to the back of the dash. Now the dash is ready to go. Drain your radiator of about 1 gallon of coolant. A simple solution is to get a cheap hand pump, such as from Harbor Freight, and extract it from the radiator. Using a clean jug, you can reuse that coolant once you've installed the new coolant sender. Using the supplied brass hardware, remove and replace the water sender on the lower intake, being sure not to over-tighten the sender as it is soft brass. Use thread tape on the brass fittings. In our application, we installed it into the thread port in the water neck. We ran the oil and water sender wires through an existing hole in the firewall. For aesthetics, we also installed braided loom on our sender wires, however, this is not required. Remove the factory oil sender and replace with the Dakota Digital oil sender. Do note that in our case, we had to remove one bolt of the mechanical fuel pump fuel block-off plate for easy tightening of the oil sender, as this car is EFI. If your vehicle still has a mechanical fuel pump and access to the oil sender is difficult, consider purchasing our oil filter sandwich, which gives you multiple oil ports and installs in minutes. I should note that as we begin wiring this vehicle, we do offer Ford license wiring diagrams on USB on our website for 1967 to 73 Mustangs, which covers the entire wiring of your car. We will, at a later point in this video, show you the wiring table for your gauges. However, you can actually have the wiring diagrams for your entire vehicle. Using the wiring tables of Appendix A from our website, and your appropriate year Mustang, such as 6970 with or without tack, you can now prepare your harness right at your kitchen table. If using a Dakota Digital system, also consider our optional ferrule tool kit to give you that added professional installation look. For the Holley Pro Dash, you will attach your Super Seal pins to the end of the Digital Easy harness wires as shown here, and for other gauge systems, simply use the butt connectors provided to connect to your manufacturer's wire to the Digital Easy harness. It's really that simple. For wires that are not used, you can either depin them using a small screwdriver, or you can use our supplied heat shrink tubing to cap them off. Use the Dakota Digital Quick Start Guide for the sender wire to the control box. They are clearly color coded and it makes it really easy. For all Mustangs for 69 to 1973 that are equipped with a factory tachometer, you will use the Newrad Solutions supplied jumper to connect the plug of the OEM harness that you disconnected when removing the cluster. Failure to perform this step will result in the vehicle not starting. Vehicles that did not come factory with a tachometer can skip this step. The factory tachometer was in series with the ignition and must be replaced, or your vehicle, as mentioned previously, will not start. Now, for those of you who have Mustangs that did not come with a factory tachometer, you will need to source your tach signal. Newrad Solutions does offer an affordable tachometer kit available from our website. If you're using a regular ignition coil, you will need to add a tach wire or use our tach wire kit to connect a ring terminal to an 18 gauge wire and into the negative or minus terminal of the ignition coil. If you are using a Dakota Digital system, you can connect the wire directly to the tach input of the control box. If you are using an MSD ignition box, do not use the negative or minus terminal of the coil. You will need to use the tach output of the MSD ignition box, and you may also need an MSD 8920 tach adapter. Digital output boxes such as the 6AL typically require the tach adapter. A way to check is if you rev up the car and it's erratic on your tachometer when using the MSD box, you will need to wire in the tach adapter. I should note that if you are using a Holley Pro Dash, do not connect the output of the coil to your tach or you will damage your new dash. This is also similar for some other gauge manufacturers to be aware of. Be sure to follow your dash and tach manufacturer's instructions. For the Holley Pro Dash, you will either use the output of your aftermarket ECU, say such as a Terminator or Sniper, or you will use the output of the MSD ignition box that has a 5-volt tach signal output. I cannot stress enough, do not go straight from the coil directly to your Holley box or your Holley gauge cluster, or you can damage it. For those with 69 to 73 Mustangs that are using an MSD box, you'll use the tach output of the MSD box as the input to your gauge system. Do not use the terminal of your coil to your tach input if you are using an ignition box. For wiring purposes, note that Dakota Digital tachometer inputs are voltage controlled and you will be following the wiring as below. Use the tach adapter instructions for other gauge systems. If you need a tach adapter, you will wire as follows. The white will go to the ignition tach output, the black will go to ground, the red will go to the ignition, and the purple will be the tach input to your gauge system, or in this case, the Dakota Digital tach input. It's worth noting here some advantages of the Dakota Digital control box, such as reverse polarity, short circuit protection, and it also provides up to 400 volts of protection on the input of the tachometer, as well as providing a light open collector pull-up for you, especially for those with an HEI distributor. You don't have to provide an external resistor, it actually handles it for you. Next, you'll attach our Digital Easy harness to the factory gauge connector. Noticing that there's no splice to the factory harness, no need to wire colors, you'll just simply follow the wiring table. Use the supplied ground wire, ring terminal, and number 10 screw to connect a clean metal for a chassis ground. Use a crimper to attach the ring terminal to the wire that is labeled ground. The other end of the wire will connect to the ground input of your gauge system and/or control box. It is recommended to use a clean chassis ground to ensure proper grounding. For 69 to 70 Mustangs, you can use the ground that is located behind the gauge cluster as shown here. It is not recommended to use any ground in the gauge connector itself. Beware, some black wires in the OEM connector are actually not grounds and are open-ended. Now we'll need to make up our 12-volt constant power supply. Using the supplied wire labeled constant power, on one end strip 3/8 inch of wire, crimp on the supplied 1/4 inch female spade connector. On the other end of the wire, you will be connected to a 12-volt constant input on the Dakota Digital box or the equivalent wire of your gauge manufacturer. You'll want to remove the glass fuse as shown here in circuit 6, insert the provided glass fuse tap, and then reinstall the fuse. Now you can connect the female spade connector to the tab on the fuse tap. Optionally, you can purchase a flex fuse adapter from our website to convert the glass fuse to a newer AGC style fuse and apply the female spade connector. Make sure the fuse is the same or smaller current than the glass fuse it replaces. Okay, now we're going to wire up our GPS. Now the first thing you're going to have is you're going to have your GPS BIM cable and your GPS unit. Now in that cable, in the GPS BIM cable, is already a ground wire, so you don't need to add an additional ground. The ground wire that we established previously from the chassis will go to the control box. Next, we will take our GPS antenna, we'll screw it into the BIM box, and then route the antenna wire up to the lower windshield, or you can use the upper windshield along the A-pillar. In this case, the customer chose to put it up on the passenger side A-pillar. Next, we will run the GPS power wire that is provided in the installation kit and run it from the battery input of the BIM box, and we will share the other end of that wire with the 12-volt input using the same 12-volt power wire that we created from our fuse box. If you're using our ferrule kit, you can just use a blue ferrule. It will handle two 18-gauge wires into the same port. It's important to note that the GPS BIM box must be hard mounted to maintain its accuracy. In our case, we simply took advantage of a hole in a bracket that was underneath the dash, used some hardware, used some number 8 screws and nuts with lock washers, and we're able to mount it in a nice secure location. Now the nice thing about the Dakota Digital GPS setup is it comes GPS ready, so there is no calibration to do. You simply plug it in and go. Next, we install the Dakota Digital switch, making sure to plug it into the control box. We simply mounted it on the left underside of the dash, making for a simple install. Now you can reinstall the gauge cluster using the factory screws, being sure to plug into the back of the dash from the Dakota control box the main cable. Now we will reinstall the negative battery terminal and test the functions of our gauge prior to reinstalling the dash console. Test for high beams, turn signals, etc. to make sure that the dash is functional and we're ready to go. Now with our gauges fully functional, you can use the reverse process to install your gauge console back into the vehicle. Next, you will want to enter setup mode to set up your dash. It's very easy to do. While pressing switch 1, you will turn the ignition switch to the run position. You can refer to the Dakota Digital Quick Start Guide for more detailed setup information. But you will select for the speed input, we'll go to BIM. You will select the proper fuel sender. For this year of this Mustang, the OEM sender is a Ford 7310 to correspond to the resistance of that sender. You will select the oil and water senders, then you will set your odometer to the desired value. You can either leave it at 0 or to the desired value of their dash to match your existing dash, and you have 100 miles of actual driving before the system locks it. We'd like to thank Dakota Digital. Be sure to visit our website at newradsolutions.com and order your gauge installation kit for this or many other vehicles we carry. And congratulations to Dean on your successful RTX install.